and then he would dip them in tea, that old good traditional method of making things look old, and stick them on new bottles, and he would mix some real vintage wine with cheap wine, and that was how he created more and more bottles. But he did make some mistakes, like wine from a year before an actual vineyard had started making wine and things like that. And that was how he eventually got caught. And it's thought to be the largest wine fraud in history. What's really interesting is that because people were told the wine was good and was expensive, they believed that it must be. Loads of the wine had to be thrown away. There were some bottles that they thought could be saved, and so the US Marshals, trying to make back what money they could for people who'd been defrauded, did have an auction of some of the wine just before Christmas this year. And they said that they thought it was probably real, but they couldn't absolutely guarantee it. And yet, 3 bottles of a 1911 Romane Conti went for $43,000, even though people knew it was his. Although this example might suggest to the contrary, what is interesting is that on the whole, wine experts do better than the rest of us at tastings, which you would hope they do. In an analysis of 6,000 blind tastings, only the experts knew which were genuinely expensive. If people were told it was expensive, then they thought it tasted better. So they, again, put people in a brain scanner. They fed them wine through a straw, which may not be the ideal way of drinking wine, but who knows. And they told them it cost anywhere between $5 and $90. And people liked the ones that they were told were expensive much more. But what's really interesting is that our brains are wine snobs too, if you like, because there was more activity in the reward centres for the ones where they were told it was expensive. So they were actually genuinely enjoying it more because they thought it was more expensive. We love things that we know to be expensive so much that sometimes it is worth paying more for the same thing. If you take painkillers, ibuprofen, cheap generic version, and this is a fancier version. They have the same ingredients, but one has lovely fancy packaging and is branded, and it shows it's powerful with the picture. In a trial, people's headaches actually went faster if they took the expensive branded one, even though they contain the same thing. In a way, there was the placebo effect was harnessed, and the fact that they thought it was going to be good meant it was. So if your headache is really, really bad, maybe you do want to spend more on exactly the same thing, that maybe it does actually work. Or if you take an all-you-can-eat buffet. Obviously, the idea with an all-you-can-eat buffet is to get as much food as you can for as little money as possible. But there was a study done in the States. Some of the people paid a higher price and some of them paid a lower price. The people who paid the higher price actually enjoyed the meal much more, and they felt less full at the end, which suggests that when it was cheap, that people were more tempted to overeat because it was such a bargain, whereas when it was expensive and they were paying more, they actually took more care over choosing and didn't overeat. This doesn't mean that you should always just buy the most expensive item or even go for the mid-priced item. I want you to imagine you want to buy a laptop. You don't want anything fancy, you just want to be able to browse the web with it and write some documents on it and keep some stuff on it. So you decide, well, there's lots of cheap laptops around, I'm going to go and buy one. And you will often find that they're laid out in threes. This is from a real website, a cheap laptop for £329. A bit fancier, same make, faster processing speeds, and that's $479. But then cleverly next to it, you'll find this very fancy one, which is £1,999. What people will do psychologically is they came in, they were going to buy the cheap item, had a quick look and they saw the really fancy one and they thought, no, I don't need anything as fancy as that. I can't afford that. That's too expensive. I won't have that. And they then think, I'm being very good about this. And they compromise. It's called the compromise effect. They compromise on buying the middle one instead, when they never intended to do that. If they'd just seen the two, they'd have thought, well, what's the point in getting the more expensive one? The cheaper one looks fine. People will very often be tempted to buy the mid-priced item. Since reading all the research on this, I've tried very hard not to buy the mid-priced item, but it's very, very tempting. I just find myself wanting to do it all the time. Once we know about these things, we can try to have mind over money, if you like. We can try to observe these biases in ourselves. Now, interestingly, we can also get distracted by completely irrelevant prices through what's known as anchoring. There's been lots of work done on this by Daniel Kahneman and others that you might know of, which is where a number affects our decisions. Even though it's completely irrelevant, it makes a difference to our decisions. So in one study, people were asked how much they would be prepared to pay for a menu in a restaurant, an imaginary restaurant called Studio 17, and how much they would be prepared to pay in a restaurant called Studio 97. People were prepared to pay more in the second restaurant, even though the word 97 in its title, had absolutely nothing to do with anything. Now, there are all sorts of cognitive biases that mean we don't always make the best financial decisions. And the optimism bias is an obvious one. Most of us think we will be better off in the future. We think we'll earn more in the future. We think we'll save more in the future. And we think we'll spend less in the future. Just as we all think we'll have more time in the future and that we'll be more organised versions of ourselves. And I don't want to disappoint you, but sadly you probably won't. Unless you're going to take some real steps to do that, you're not going to have more time in the future or be more organised. Nor are you probably going to save more and spend less unless you take real steps to do this. Research shows that we make better decisions when we're feeling grumpy and also when we're not desperate for money. So actually going shopping when you're feeling grumpy or going to do something where you really want to think about whether it's a good deal while you're grumpy, maybe looking at houses, is a good idea. And we also make better decisions when we're not desperate for money. And some of you will know the research from Sendil Mullainathan in the States on scarcity, where he found that when something such as money becomes more scarce, people's thinking narrows and their IQ can even drop. And they become more likely to make unwise decisions because of the stress and the cognitive overload of trying to deal with not having enough money and being really worried about where you're going to get your rent at the end of the week or whatever it is you need. No wonder then that people get stuck with debts that they can't pay. You know, no one sets out to get stuck with big debts. People genuinely believe they can pay it back. Now, struggling to make ends meet is undoubtedly hugely stressful. But what about the opposite? One big question with money that people always ask is, you know, does money make people happy or not? And stories of lottery winners seem to hold a strange fascination for us because we know that there are these people who suddenly find themselves stratospherically wealthy, and we try to imagine what that would be like. We also, interestingly, expect the winners to be deserving, even though the word lottery is in the title. And we don't like it if we find that, you know, people have, you know, a terrible criminal past and win loads of money. People then say, well, it should be paid